Hello there and welcome back to another edition of Forza Top Gear Laps. Today we're taking a look at some retro sports cars. We kick things off with the 1988 Mitsubishi Starion ESI-R. 188 horsepower, 234 foot-pound torque, 3,087 pounds of weight. This is the least powerful car here today. However, it does have a fair amount of torque thanks to its turbocharged engine. I do rather like the Mitsubishi Starion. It is a rather forgotten car these days, especially when it comes to the 80s and early 90s sports car scene. But the Starion is pretty cool because it has all of the makings of a classic 80s sports car. It's got the pop-up headlights, the wedgie design, and all the rest of it. Of course, the one difference between the Starion and pretty much every other 80s and 90s sports car, of course, is that this thing does have some rallying pedigree, which is pretty cool. As far as the Starion goes to drive in Forza, well, obviously this is one of the slower cars here today. It is actually one of the heavier cars. Yeah, hovering around 3,000 pounds. There's a lot of cars that are hovering around that weight today. Of course, they have slightly more power though. It is a nice and easy car to drive, this one, certainly. There's no qualms about that. If this is sort of your first time driving a car in Forza, if you load it up with the Starion, I can't see you having too many issues. It is a little bit wobbly on the suspension, of course. Again, it has some rallying pedigree, which that could be part of the reason that has wobbly suspension. Of course, as well, it's an older car, so for the most part they do have issues with sort of suspension rolling around and so on and so forth, but that doesn't really affect the Starion all too much. Next up, I apologise to your eardrums because this thing does not sound very good at all. It's the 1992 Nissan Silvia K's, 202 horsepower, 202 foot-pound torque, 2,535 pounds of weight. This is the least torquey car here today. However, it is the lightest, and it's actually the lightest by quite some ways, which I was fairly surprised with, I guess. Of course, it is the second oldest car here today. Older cars are usually lighter. But yeah, was not quite expecting the Silvia to be as light as it is. Of course, one advantage of the Silvia is that it does come in a two-tone paint job, which I do rather like. Gotta admit, never really been a huge fan of the Nissan Silvia. The only one that I really like is the S15. All the rest of them I've sort of been very meh on the internet. Doesn't particularly help with that. I will say the S13 is growing on me a little bit more. I much prefer the North American versions with the sort of flat nose on them. But, you know, this version with the raised nose, it isn't too terrible, I guess. I'm talking about the one with the pop-up headlights, of course. As far as this car goes to drive, it is actually pretty decent to drive, as you'd sort of expect from the Nissan Silvia. It does have some sort of moderate oversteer. Again, that would be expected of a Nissan Silvia. Of course, these things are used as drifting platforms. So, yeah, it's not surprising that it occasionally likes to break loose, but yeah, if you bear that in mind, this is not a bad car, and it feels like one of those that sort of, you could really build this up to be something completely different to what it is now. You could build it up to be a drift car, or a drag car, or a circuit car, or whatever you wanted to. Next up, 1987 Mazda RX7, 261 horsepower, 217 foot-pound torque, 2,831 pounds of weight. Of course, this RX7 is of what they call the FD generation, my personal favourite of the Mazda RX7 range. Although not my favourite of the rotors, I do have a liking for the RX8. Unfortunately, we do not have a Spirit R in this game, which is a little bit of a shame, so instead we've got this, I believe it's a North American market, Mazda RX7, no wing either, which is very, very unfortunate. Despite that though, I do like the RX7, it is a cool looking car, and of course I love that rotary engine. As far as it goes to drive, this thing has an absolutely excellent chassis. You can really tell that when you're following this thing through the corners. It feels so planted and so rigid and just, it's great. It honestly does not feel like driving a car from, you know, 20 years ago now. It does feel relatively modern. It does have a little bit of a sliding issue. Of course, as you expect, it's rear-wheel drive, that happens. But overall, similar to how it is in many previous Forza titles, it is a fantastic car to drive. Not quite as good as it used to be in Forza 5. It was by far and away, in my opinion, the best driving of sort of this Japanese sports car range. But nevertheless, it is still a very good car in this game. Next up, 1997 Maserati Ghibli Cup, a 326 horsepower, 273 foot-pound torque, 3,009 pounds of weight. This is the most powerful car here today, and the torquiest car here today. Of course, you could make the argument that the Ghibli is actually a GT car, or Ghibli, or however you're supposed to pronounce it. I'm probably going to switch between the two. You could make an argument that it's a GT car, but let's be honest, it's more of a sports car. I wouldn't really want to go for a GT cruise in this car per se. Of course, this car comes from the range of Maseratis when they weren't all particularly great. In fact, they were all rather awful. But you know, the Ghibli Cup is still thought of to be probably the best car of that era of Maserati, and these things are actually worth a decent amount of money these days. You can buy them for around 10 grand, which, let's be honest, that's about the same as you can buy a Quattroporte for. As far as it goes to drive, it is a good car to drive. The Ghibli it does have a bit of a weight issue. You can definitely feel that this car is heavier than the rest through the corners. Of course, I drove this straight after driving the Mazda RX7, which is a very compact car, very light car. So that might have been why this felt heavy, but just in general, it does feel a little bit heavier than usual, but it is still nevertheless a rather good car to drive, and no real complaints about it. Next up, 1987 Nissan Skyline GTR V-Spec, 278 horsepower, 271 foot-pound torque, 3,393 pounds of weight. Of course, I had to chuck in a Nissan Skyline into this at some point, and we have the R33, which is the only Skyline of sort of the main GTR range, R32, R33, R34. The R33 was the only one to not go around the track. Well, now it's here in fantastic midnight purple, as it should be. I do like the R33. As out of sort of R32, 33 and 34, I would probably say the R33 is my favourite, although the 32 is sort of creeping up there at the moment. Yeah, just a nice looking car in general. It's the one I'd buy out of all of them purely because it's, well, it's the cheapest and seems to be the easiest to live with on a day-to-day basis. Unfortunately, as far as it drives in game, it can only really be said to be okay. This is definitely the weakest driving of all of the sort of GTR Skylines in the game. It does suffer from a fair amount of understeer, which is something the R34 and R32 do have, although to a lesser degree. The one thing you really notice with this car is it has long gear ratios, like excessively long gear ratios. Not quite sure what that's all about. Perhaps Japan had some weird fuel economy rules coming in, or something that required the gears to be ridiculously long. Yeah, the gears are long, but it's an okay car nonetheless to drive. It's just not as good as the other GTRs available. Next up, 1998 Eagle Talon TSI Turbo, 210 horsepower, 214 foot-pound torque, 3,200 pounds of weight. This car is actually a lot heavier than I thought it was on paper, actually. This is the third heaviest car here today, and it is, well, probably one of the smallest dimension-wise. Of course, it has all-wheel drive. For those of you who don't know, the Eagle Talon is basically a Mitsubishi Eclipse, and we have actually had a Mitsubishi Eclipse go around the track before, so it'll be interesting to see how the Talon deals with the Eclipse. Interesting fact about the Talon. The Eclipse and the Talon have very similar statistics, however there is about a 30 PI difference between these cars. I've never really been quite... I have no idea why that is. And to be fair, driving the Talon, I can't see why the Eclipse has that much advantage. I mean, they drive pretty much the same. It is a slow car. There is no getting around the fact that the Eagle Talon is not a quick car. 210 horsepower, sure, in real world it probably feels relatively quick, but in game it just does not feel quick, especially after driving stuff like the Skyline and so on. It is a great handling that car though. Of course, all-wheel drive, 210 horsepower, you're not really going to get yourself into too much trouble with that, and thankfully, you know, this is a decent enough platform. Of course, the Talon and Eclipse were based on basically economy cars, but nevertheless they are still relatively good platforms. Next up, 2002 BMW Z3M Coupe, 315 horsepower, 251 foot-pound torque, 3,170 pounds of weight. You may have been expecting the E36 M3 here, or even the E46, but no, I decided to go for the Z3M Coupe because it makes its triumphant return to Forza Motorsport in this game. A car which I've never really been all that much of a fan of. It is a weird looking car. I'm not really a fan of the Z3 to begin with, but the Coupe does look better than the convertible, I guess. It's a little bit more interesting to be seen with, and I love the wide fenders on this. Also, this car is more equivalent to a European spec E36. Of course, the E36 M3 in-game is the North American version, I believe, and this one is, well, the E36. The E36 and the Z3 basically shared platform, so the Z3M is basically an E36. As far as this one goes to drive, it is a very good car to drive. It is quick. It is probably the quickest car overall in a straight line here today, by quite a margin, in fact. Yeah, really rather quick. Does like to have a bit of a slide on, of course, moderately slidey. Very similar to how you'd sort of expect a BMW to be. Again, I've spoke at length before about BMWs and how they're great starter drift cars if you just sort of want something that you don't have to do too much to. And the Z3M can sort of bask in that glory, as can the E36 M3, on which it's based. And finally today, again, another weird difference I decided to throw in here, the 2003 Infiniti G35 Coupe, 280 horsepower, 270 foot-pound torque, 3,455 pounds of weight. Once again, you could make the argument that this is a personal luxury car. However, I was sort of looking at anything else interesting I could add to this episode, and I don't want 3 Nissans in one episode, so I decided to go, instead of the 350Z, with the G35, which is basically a 350Z, but bigger and more luxurious. And also much less powerful in the case of this game for some reason. Maybe there were different states of tunes. Well, obviously there were different state of tunes on the engine that this car has. Of course, the least tuned of all of them, featuring in the Renault Velsatis, car you should look up if you don't know what that is. And this, I'm assuming, has like the mid-tuned engine, and the 350Z has the big 330 horsepower all-out engine. I think the G37 also has that engine. Oh no, that'll be the... Anyways, ignoring that, this car's okay. It's nothing special. That's why I was sort of just drowning you in information, just rambling. There's nothing interesting to really say about this car. It's okay to drive. It's nothing spectacular. Go for the 350Z, basically. It is all I'm going to tell you about the G35. It's just not particularly great. It's heavy. It's slower than a 350. Not a bad car, just nothing exciting, really. Anyways, onto the leaderboard, and unsurprisingly, the fastest car today was the Z3M Coupe, going in 74th place with a 123.307, an actually very, very quick car. Beats out the 2 other Skyline GTRs we've had around, the R34 and the R32 respectively, and it's not that far off of a Maserati Gran Turismo, interestingly enough. In 88th place, we find the Mazda RX7 with a 125.183, which is actually rather good when you consider its PI not too far off a Charger SRT8. In 90th place is the Nissan Skyline GTR V-Spec with a 125.644, marginally beating out a Subaru Impreza 22B, Rolls-Royce Dawn, Audi Quattro, and Evo 8. A pretty good time for the R33, especially considering that car just is not the best to drive, really. Moving down the board some more, in 98th place we find the Maserati Ghibli Cup with a 126.005, beats out a Lamborghini Miura, so there you go, there's something the old 90s Maseratis could do. They could beat out a 60s Lamborghini supercar. The G35 Coupe goes into 102nd place with 126.520, does beat out an 037 Stradale and a Lotus Elise, but PI wise those 2 cars are way behind that one, so not a hugely quick time. In 129th place we find the Nissan Silvia K's with a 130.162, beating out an old Porsche 911 Carrera. In 131st we find the Mitsubishi Starion ESI-R with a 130.351, beating out a Savannah RX7, interestingly enough, and actually beating out the Mitsubishi Galant VR4 as well. So yeah, the Starion actually rather quick. I was not expecting it to beat the FC RX7. On paper the FC should be slightly quicker, I believe. And finally today, unsurprisingly, the slowest car today in 141st place was the Eagle Talon TSI Turbo with a 131.599. Interestingly enough, only 0.5 of a second between the Eclipse and the Talon, despite the 30 PI difference. So, really not sure what to go with. If you're going to upgrade a car for racing, go for the Talon over the Eclipse, because you basically get 33 PI in the Talon. So, go for that. Anyways, I want to thank you all very much for watching this edition of Forza Top Gear Laps. As always, if you have themes or suggestions for cars you'd like to see take on the Top Gear course, do feel free to leave them down below in the comment section. Next time, I'm going to be wrapping up the sports car series looking at modern sports cars, so join me for that, and until then, farewell.
If I come on like a dream.